Today, I'm with Peter Downs, National Manager at Play by the Rules, a national government and non-government initiative that promotes safe, fair and inclusive sport. Peter's been in the role for about 7 years. One of his projects was developing the national framework for inclusion for disadvantaged populations in sport, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. Peter's also the director of the Inclusion Club, which he co-founded nearly 10 years ago, which is a non-profit health promotion charity sharing best practice in sport, physical activity and disability. Before these roles, Peter was at the Australian Sports Commission for about 18 years as the manager of the Disability Unit, rolling out national programs to support people with disability in sport and physical activity. Peter's also been the Vice President of the International Federation of Adapted Physical Activity. Now, Peter's got a long list of awards, but just some of them are, he was awarded the 2013 Churchill Fellowship to study the hallmarks of inclusive practice in the US, UK and Finland. And unbelievably, he was awarded the Australian Sports Medal in 2002 from the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Now, Peter is an absolute powerhouse in the inclusion and diversity space with over 30 years experience in the sector, and through his roles has also become an authority in sport integrity and ethics. So I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Peter Downs today. How are you travelling, Peter?
Good, thanks, David. I was just listening to all that and having some memories coming back there. But good, thanks, Dave.
Yeah, I bet it was quite a challenge to decipher and just shorten your bio, actually. There's quite a lot of achievements, so it is an absolute honour to chat with you today. So we'll get straight into it. What does well-being mean to you?
It's a one word with a very complex probably answer. I imagine you've been given a few, but to me, it's personally, it's to be comfortable with the person that you are, to what you stand for and your little spot in the world that we have, that I have. If you're comfortable with that, which basically I have been for the last 30 years or so. Prior to that, I was like most of the younger people of my time at that stage. I just went from one thing to the next and didn't really know what I was going to do. Until I sort of stumbled across the area of work, really, which I might describe a bit later. For me, it's about being comfortable with who you are and what you're contributing to the world. It gives me that sense of well-being.
Yeah, and I think that comes with experience and, time, doesn't it? I think when you're in your 20s, you go out a lot maybe, and in your 30s, you become a little bit more comfortable. And in your 40s, for me anyway, I seem to be getting a bit more in my stride and comfortable with who I am.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, yeah. Not that I've particularly ever been that uncomfortable, but I think I didn't have a purpose, particularly in my young days, and not that I was unhappy with that. But I think when you look back now, you think, I know what gives me the sense now, that sense of purpose of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, fantastic. So, what are some of the things that you do to look after your well-being?
Yeah, well, coffee helps. Apart from the usual, exercise and eating and sleeping, which I still exercise a fair bit most days of the week, and we eat pretty well here. Don't sleep probably as much as I should, but apart from all that, I think that sense of purpose in life, that you're doing something meaningful. I'm approaching an age now where I might stop full-time work or paid employment type work. I can't ever see myself stopping in this kind of work. That just doesn't picture for me at all. So I can't go on a life that's just all about me and having fun. I think I always have to do something that's worthwhile and contributes, and that sense of purpose, I think, is really, really important for me, and I guess I'm guessing for a lot of other people too.
Yeah, I'm loving that purpose is coming out so strong for you, and that lifelong passion that you've got for safe, fair, and inclusive sport, which you've obviously built your career on. Like, where's that come from?
Well, I thought about that question before, and I've only told this tale a couple of times, but it was the moment that the moment that this stumbled across me, this area of work could be something I'm really interested in. It was about, oh gosh, in the 80s. And I was working in a summer camp in the south of England, in Portsmouth, there. And I was teaching cricket. I was an instructor. I wouldn't say I was a coach. I was never a coach of cricket, but I was the instructor for groups of young people who came from all over the country and from Europe. As well, and they would do sport in the morning and they'd learn English. We'd teach English in the afternoon for those who came from overseas. One particular week, and I'd done that work for a couple of years in between my sports studies degree. And one year this young fellow turns up, Tim. He was ambulant, but not very ambulant. He fell over a fair bit. He had cerebral palsy, but he loved his cricket. And he signed up for every one of my sessions, which no one ever did. Everyone, I mean, seriously. And on the Friday, by the Friday came around, Tim was the only one who signed up for my session, because by Friday the kids had had enough, they'd done enough. And I said, okay, all right, Tim, I built up quite a friendship with him. I'd never taught or had really much to do with disability or young people until that point, really. Yes, looking back, I had a really good attitude towards it, and he was a great young kid. And so I said, okay, all right, what we'll do is we'll go into the nets, we'll get the whites on, we'll use a proper ball, because we've been using softballs and tennis balls all week, use a proper bat, and we'll go and have a training session. How about that? And he said, yeah, he was really into it. And I thought, in my head, I was going, I wonder how this is going to go, I didn't really know. And so I went in, I took the bat, and I said, okay, Tim, you line up and you can bowl, I'll go and we'll change over. I did all the marking up, get my guard and everything else. And I thought about it, Tim's hand was like this, he's like almost like my hand is these days, it's like that. I thought, well, it's not beyond comprehension. I know a bit about cricket, I knew cricket. He says, well, that's a leg spinner's grip. And if he was able to release it at the right moment, the timing of release, he would automatically impart a spin on the ball, which I had a ball here, I could show you. But that's the leg spinning grip, and he had it permanently in his hand. So there was a long shot, but it could work. So anyway, the first ball comes down and goes over the top of the net and into the road somewhere. Not so great. Second ball comes down and it's in the third net along. So I thought, okay, all right, one more, and then we'll change over. So I don't want to dispirit him or anything like that. And the third ball was the Gatting ball.
Oh, right, round the legs from Warney.
For those people who are watching don't know cricket, I was sure Dave would know what I'm talking about, but it's the famous ball of Shane Warne, first ever in England, I think, to Mike Gatting, and it is a leg spinner. It came out of his hand, and this is no word of a lie. This is exactly what happened. It pitched about half a foot, maybe 6-7 inches outside left stump, and cut across me and bowled me on the off stump. And I tried to play it. I didn't let it go. Tried to play it. Just Tim went ballistic. He went mad. He would tease me about it for the rest of the time, and wrote to me afterwards as well, saying, how good was that? And I thought at that time, and that's had a huge influence on my thinking since then, because I thought, oh, can you study? Because I knew a bit about cricket. I had a pretty good attitude to it, and I thought, can you study this stuff? Can you study about disability sport and how to get people involved? Because really, all I did was apply a good attitude was the first thing, and the second thing was, I knew a bit about cricket, and I could see what his hand was like. I said, well, this might work, and with a bit of, by fluke, it did work. And I then went on a few months later to study a master's in adapted physical activity. So I went and studied in Belgium. So as it happens, you can study that. So I studied in a master's degree for that, and the day I handed my master's thesis in, which was about inclusion, I flew to Australia. That's when I started in Australia. So from there I thought, that's what I want to do in life. That's what I want to study, and that's how it turned out. When I got a job at the Sports Commission, it wasn't in that area, but at that time they were looking to rewrite the activities manual for children with disabilities that had been around for a little while at that stage. And I was just happened to be the right person in the right spot. So I'll never forget that day. They said, Peter, can you do this job? And I said, you beauty, yes I can.
I think timing's a wonderful thing, but what a beautiful story to, set you on a path of your career, but also, for obviously, your cricketer, and to provide a miracle ball like that, Tim, it's fantastic. So thank you for sharing that. That was really good. And in terms of play by the rules and the Inclusion Club, how does that fit into the health and wellness system then?
Well, play by the rules is my paid employment. That's been around now for 17 or 18 years or so, and started in South Australia through the Office of Sport and Recreation there, and the the Equal Opportunity Commission at that time.
Yeah.
And there have been a few instances around child safety and inclusion diversity issues at that time, and they wanted a platform where they could share resources out to the community. Cut a very long story short, that grew over the years to be a collaboration between 20 partners now, human rights and equal opportunity agencies across the country, including the Australian Human Rights Commission, Sport Australia, Sport Integrity Australia, all the state departments are all on board with one MOU that looks at safe, fair and inclusive sport. It's a beautiful system. It's complex in some ways, but simple in another. It's one of three outcomes, one national manager, but a network of people all in those agencies who contribute to it too. So I constantly work with them all the time, although it's not their paid job. I'm the only paid employee. And I think that the place of a perceived, it's not really an independent as such, because it is sponsored and supported by government. But I have a great deal more flexibility to behave in almost a private entrepreneurial way, backed by government, which gives me a tremendous freedom. I worked in government for 18 years or whatever it was, and so I know how difficult it is to act quickly and to be that entrepreneurial in a government sense. But you can do that by the rules. It does take a bit of experience to pull it off, I have to say, and it's the most multi-skilled job I've ever had. But I think the place to play by the rules now is a great spot to be in, because it crosses the divide between recreation and sport. It's aimed at community sport in there, and it provides resources, information, media campaigns, tools, resources, awards, which I've been working on this morning, and all those kinds of things. And I have the flexibility to be able to drive them really quite hard.
Yeah. And I heard how many awards is, I think you had a lot of nominations for those awards. There's only 2 awards, I think, isn't it, that you can give? Or
more, because there was 131 nominations this year over clubs and associations. A bit different. I was debating whether to do it this year, to be honest, though, because everything else going on, there's been flooded with things to do in community sport. But as it happens, I think people are very proud of what they've achieved to get through the period. And seriously, I've gone through every single one. We're just about to announce the winners. So we decided that yesterday. And so I've been writing to all the nominations today. And it's amazing what clubs and associations have done. It really is astonishing what they've done. And I'm going to try and make case studies out of every single one of them if I can.
Wow.
Everything from holding regular Zoom type catch-ups and meetings and connecting with members, to producing resources, to virtual activities that they almost invented overnight. It's just countless things. And I guess the role of Play by the Rules is to showcase and share that. Sharing is a big part of what Play by the Rules and Inclusion Club, for that matter, do as well.
And it's so inspiring, isn't it? From in our industry, we talk about sport and physical activity in community groups, and when we're up against that adversity and the back's against the wall, to be creative and just get on with it, really. In terms of the resources that are Play by the Rules provide, how can people get hold of those, and are those free?
Yes, they're all free. That's a great thing about it, because it's supported by government. So playbytherules.net.au. The online courses too, there are 12 online courses. We've just released a new one around the inclusion of LGBTQ people in sport, which is, I think, a world first.
Wow.
Which is a really nice course. The child protection one is the largest of that. That's been mandated by a number of sporting bodies across the country. So in a quiet month, we'd get 1,500 completions of those per month. So 18,000, 20,000 a year would complete that course alone. And harassment discrimination in a similar way, to a lesser extent in terms of its mandated requirements, but they would get 15,000 completions a year as well.
I mean, if you think about the impact of that in clubs for safeguarding and having the right structures, that's incredible achievement, Peter.
Yeah, it's a great thing it's built over years. Over years. I leverage a lot of expertise, from all kinds of agencies and contribute to it. And my job is really kind of the conductor of that orchestra, if you like. And I'm always spinning the plates, trying to keep the projects going.
Yeah.
Do the right things, but there's a lot of people involved in maintaining and updating that.
Yeah, and that's systems thinking, isn't it? Really, because that's a systems-based approach, because you've got all these different perspectives and all these different skills and strengths, and of all the different people you work with. You couldn't do it all on your own, so
Yeah, I'm happy to take the credit, but there's a mountain of people, both informal and formal partners who have worked for years and years and years. For example, we're reviewing the Child Protection Online course right now, so we're doing an update to it, which needs an update, particularly in following the Royal Commission recommendations and things like that. So I've been able to call on some really significant expertise, and like I say, my job is not to do the review. My job is to coordinate the reviewers and the panel that go into the content, and then make sure that happens online.
Yeah.
And I think the cool thing too is we don't mandate it ourselves, or we can't. We're not in that position to. But the content, because it's free and around Creative Commons, can be mandated by almost anybody. Universities included in their degree programs, sports in their accreditation programs for coaches have that as mandated requirements. We're able to cross link them into the platform that we use as well for sports such as netball and rugby and athletics and sailing, and so it's all fits into their program quite nicely.
Yeah. So you seem to get that consistency and that message, consistent message across to everybody in terms of what's required. And you've got the Diversity and Inclusion Sports Forum coming up, I think, next month. Can you tell me a little bit about the topics or the format and how people could register?
Yeah, different one this year, because as you know, we've had it live event in the past 4 years. So we had 3 in Melbourne, 1 in Sydney last year, which was designed. We're trying to make it a kind of TEDx style event, where you have maybe 8 or 10 speakers a day, 10 or 15 minutes each, a very specific topic to do with inclusion, diversity. It's not to give answers or to showcase programs. It's not that traditional kind of thing. It's to put out ideas out there and experiences of people around inclusion and diversity across a range of, we've covered a huge breadth of inclusion diversity issues in those forums. And this year we couldn't do the live. We had planned to do the live event, but it's not going to happen this year. But it'll be it's almost like an episode of The Drum, how I'm describing it. So it's a sit-down panel discussion. We've got Dr. Ben Gauntlet, who's the Disability Discrimination Commissioner and sits on the Play by the Rules Management Committee as well. There we've got Moya Dodd, who's a long history of around gender equity in particular, but a whole range of areas in the football world as well. But she brings a huge amount of experience to it. Sam Turner, she's from Westpac, so we wanted someone from kind of outside sport, but who's heavily involved in inclusion diversity is in a corporate kind of outside sports sense, to look at the comparisons and ideas and thoughts of someone who's outside sport but heavily involved in inclusion diversity issues in that. So that'll be very interesting. And Bo Newell, who's from Pride in Sport as well, looking at LGBTQ. So Bo will be hosting it because he's on part of the organising committee as well. But it'd be like an episode of The Drum, whereas a debate in a live streamed event. And people can register by going to, it's on Play by the Rules homepage, but it's playbytherules.biz, B-I-Z /T/2020 forum. But it's on Play by the Rules if you go to the homepage. There you should be able to access that. It's a free live streamed event on the 23rd of October.
Yeah, fantastic. And I encourage anybody to register, and I'll drop it in the feed when we put this out. So I'd love to just explore a little bit more around the 7 pillars of inclusion that you developed. And for those listening, the 7 pillars are access, attitudes, choice, partnerships, communication, policy, and opportunity. And this was a national framework for inclusion for disadvantaged populations. I think that was in 2016, around then when you developed it. But how has that framework impacted the system, and how have you been tracking it, and has it been implemented well into the sector?
Yeah. I'll give you a very brief background into it because it's interesting in itself. Prior to me being Play by the Rules manager, I was working closely with Play by the Rules before then, and Swimming Australia it was who approached Play by the Rules, and they wanted to develop a framework for inclusion broadly within their sport. They'd done a lot of work in the disability area over many years there, but they recognised they hadn't done much in other areas of inclusion diversity, like culturally and linguistic diverse or Indigenous inclusion, etc. But they said, where do we start as our overall framework for inclusion that we can then put some very specific work underneath? They've kind of done it typically the same way that many of the sports have done this, and I was part of that system too, where you would focus very much on your own particular area of inclusion diversity. So I was involved in the disability, but I would work also with the Indigenous Sport Unit, the Sports Commission, and the Women in Sport Unit when it was there as well. And we'd all sort of meet, talk about the same things, and we go off and do our own work. Often very similar. But we would talk about the same things, and this is what swimming was saying about 7 or 8 years ago now. They were saying we need there's similarities and differences with inclusion diversity, and we want a framework that looks at the similarities. Again, cutting that story a little bit shorter, I then went out as a contractor to Play by the Rules and talked to many people across different sectors, and all my job was to listen to the commonality of words and ideas that they were talking about, where that was relation to multicultural inclusion, disability inclusion, gender equity, discrimination issues, LGBTQ, whatever it was. I was there not to really look at the content of it, the detail, because that's the way we've done it before. This was to look at the similarities of those discussions. And over time, it took backwards and forwards and multiple webinars and all kinds of things that we did. We came up with these 7 common words, if you like, that were being used by all people, regardless of where they were would talk about access issues to a degree, for example. This is the benefit of an overall framework in that if I was to put my disability inclusion hat on, access, nearly always people think about physical access for physical disability. They don't think about particularly welcoming environments. So in that sense, applying principles of universal design, in that sense, makes sense, but that doesn't make sense as a common language for a broad framework. One, I think it's too hard, and one, it actually refers to a very specific sector as well. We wanted this to be broad enough to make sense to people at a national level who would work nationally and professionally in the industry, and those volunteers in the club level. The language had to mean the same thing. The trick of this, that's why we came up with the 7 pillars. So access was about welcoming environments. How do you create an overall welcoming environment for anybody who either emails your club or walks in the front door of your club, an association? What does that mean exactly? What do you do? What do they see? What do they hear in that sense? So that was what access meant. Sure, there was an element of physical access requirements to it as well, but overall it was around welcoming environments. The attitudes one was interesting. It's probably the most difficult one overall. That's what I studied back when I did the Masters. I looked at the attitudes of physical education teachers towards the inclusion of kids with disabilities at that stage. And there is a mountain of research that says that attitudes are key to successful inclusion. And I've got boxes of them here in the cupboards. Yeah, and I haven't kept up to date in recent years either. So they're still producing it. So why is it then that we still say that's the core problem of attitudes? We've got masses of research, lots of information about this. Why is it? And I think it's because, and listening, this is what I learned on those experiences with different people in different sectors. There's a huge gap between intention and action here. I've been in many workshops when I've asked people to put their hand up. Who supports the inclusion diversity issues in
everybody?
And I've never seen any. I would love today. It'd be great if one day someone said, "No, I don't." Fantastic, because I'd like to hear why. I'd like to have that discussion there, and everybody does, because everyone has a good intention in that way. But action is what is required. And so there's a massive gap between intention and action, which is why people coming back say, well, it must be the attitudes. Well, I don't think it is the attitude per se. It's the action that goes with it. What do people actually do to make things change? And in particularly in the disability area, more so than anywhere else, I think, is my opinion, because you require a practical change in what is happening. You require a coach needs to adapt and modify their practices, the equipment that they use, the way that they coach it. It's not the same if you're coaching women or culturally linguistic diversity. Sure, there are adaptations that are required, but here there are physical and technical ones required quite often people with disability that other areas don't have. So that overall framework of attitudes is a really tricky one and needs to be addressed, but it's the action that is required.
It's the behaviour, isn't it? It's the behaviour of people.
It's a better word. And then there was, I'll skip through them quickly because we'll be here all day, but choices was a great one, because people talked about the different choices and options. And sure, I think some of the themes that came out of that were things like, okay, look at a sport like gymnastics that probably has 10 versions of gymnastics when you include rhythmic. Trampolining is para-gymnastics, rhythmic gymnastics, men's artistic, women's, it keeps going. There's probably 10 versions. So on face value, if you looked at gymnastics as a sport, you'd say, well, there's plenty of options there. Mature age, younger, male, female, artistic, non-rhythmic. If you charted them out, you'd think there's plenty. But when you look at targeted population areas, or are there options for people whose English isn't their first language? Are there options for people with higher support needs in there? What about people from economically disadvantaged populations? When you start to really examine your demographics and because the core about inclusion for me is reflecting the community that you're in. If you look at the community that you're in, it's far more diverse than the choices that you're offering in all of the cases. Not sometimes, no, all the time.
Yeah.
It's restrictive. And that is, and it's very easy for sport and for us in the industry to think, oh, no, there's plenty of options and choices. But we're not in that. It's okay for me, but we're not in that situation where there's limited choice. So, if I was to really explore, I've done this exercise with sports, which is a really interesting one. We put what we call the inclusion spectrum, which is in the disability sense, where they apply in any area of inclusion. It's if you can picture it, it's a kind of a circular graphic that looks at the different options available from fully inclusive and non-adapted. So an option where, okay, people with disability just turn up at the local table tennis club and they play. Big deal. That happens all over sports right now. That people with fairly low support needs, to be honest, and fairly independent will turn up and everyone's just welcoming and they make it work without much change. And then you've got all the other options of minor adaptations, major adaptations, non-playing role, a sport that's only for particular targeted groups like female sport, or for sport for people with disability, sport for particular cultural groups. That's all part of the spectrum here. And I think there's one thing, we've done that exercise with sports, and when you say to sports, okay, put the choices in that spectrum that you have now, that really, and you're lucky to get more than 3 out of 7 that are there. With any significance. Everybody says, oh yeah, we have people turn up to our sports and we welcome them. Good, excellent, put it there. We have maybe some very specific versions of our sport that are a particular target population. Great, okay, put them there too. What about non-playing role? How do you actually foster opportunities and choices for people to get involved in your sport in a non-playing role? Then it starts to dwindle. How about very specific modified? How about those activities that haven't even been invented yet, that you've still got to, in its disability area in particular, but in all areas, there are versions of sport that haven't been invented yet that we're still thinking about, particularly with new technology coming in. So how about those? And it suddenly becomes very sparse indeed. And that's scratching the surfaces of the number of choices that could potentially be available. So we've got a long way to go. And I think sometimes we kid ourselves that we've got lots of choice out there. We actually, for a lot of people, we don't have many choices at all in there. So that's where choice came. There's things like partnerships. You can't do inclusion and diversity alone. You have to have partnerships internally and externally to make that happen. So that question's about who your partnerships are with, which community groups, how do you reflect the community that you're in, which have, how do you communicate that? Because it's important to let people know what you do. There's been some announcements. A lot of work this week has gone out around the inclusion of LGBTQ. And great work from Pride in Sport and all that. Those guys there, sensational work, and their communication has been exceptional with it. And they've been hammering it all week. Their communication.
I've seen it.
Anyone involved in this area would have seen it. So it's fantastic. But you've got to be able to communicate what you're doing. One of the lessons from Sports Connect, which I run for many years, to the Sports Commission, the one thing that the sports had to do, signed up for Sports Connect, was make a public commitment. And some of them did it. Football Federation Australia did it at a match with 90,000 people at Sydney Football Stadium with a presentation on the pitch. And once they made that commitment, it's hard for them to back down. So we held them accountable for that for 5 years. Because you said you were going to do this kind of thing. So communication is important. Policy was one of the areas too, which was consistently talked about. Now, policy is necessary and important. I don't want to undermine the importance of it, but it tends to be something that comes off the shelf once something bad happens. So they're very rarely a preventative, proactive thing. Codes of conduct and policies are necessary, but they're not really something that is that kind of preventative. What I'm trying to say is they're kind of not the something. They tell me something that we can use when something bad happens, and the policy then will then come out. Necessary to have, and all people that I talked to spoke about policy and the importance of that. But I tend to think that certainly at national level, I think this is true. We spend 80% of our time developing policy and codes, and our work is exceptional in that area, but very little in education, training, awareness, all that. And I think that needs to shift that balance so that we've got 80% of our work goes into education and awareness raising about the issues that are there, and less are on the codes and policies. We seem to love doing that stuff. We love doing it. And we're really good at it, to be honest. The codes and policies, and they're fantastic, really. But that hasn't really changed much in themselves alone. But policy is definitely an important area. So what the Seven Pillars tried to do, and I think has been doing with swimming, certainly very successful. National Rugby League adopted the approach. Gymnastics, netball with One Netball was based around Seven Pillars. What we always said to sports were use the framework of it, but use it in your own way. It's not a guideline that you must adopt this way. Use the basics of it, the language of it, to look at that. The success of it, Swimming Australia originally developed an online portal where the people in the swimming clubs register for that online portal. They can track and measure through a questionnaire survey that they can complete, that tracks their progress or measures their progress in each of the 7 pillar areas. So they're able to see at a snapshot where they are weak and where they are strong. So they can be strong in policy, which most of them are, to be honest, but weak in communication. So they say, we don't actually tell people much about this. We've got it on a website. We don't actually promote it. We don't have big days of celebrating it, all that kind of thing. So it's a vehicle really just to say, okay, these are some core areas that we need to look at for inclusion and diversity, and this is where we're actually already quite good at, but these are not so good at. So then they're able to go away and say, okay, we would recommend they develop a one-pager. You don't need a 25-page strategic planning document for this. A one-pager charter that outlines the 2 or 3 things you can do to address your weaknesses in this area in the following year. And that, after years of working around that, particularly with Sports Connect, that came up as the best. As people like Sporting Wheelies in Queensland are still doing this. They'll go out and they'll develop charters between disability sector groups and sports and say, you agree on these 2 or 3 things you're going to achieve this year in the next 12 months, particularly at times like this, when a million other things going on. But think about 2 or 3 things you can improve in how you communicate your commitment to inclusion, diversity there. Yeah. And the following year they might change them. But that's I think that's quite a nice. It's a language that speaks to wherever you are in the sports sector. And pretty easy. You've got to make it easier for people to do. Yes, you make it too complicated, it's not gonna happen. So.
Well, what do they say? Complexity is the enemy of action. So I think simplicity is, and I love a one-pager with a few actions on there, and it just they keep it concise and do a few things well. Obviously, swimming, from what you're saying, they've really implemented the 7 pillars and the tracking it. But in terms of, I know this is really general, but there's obviously a lot of sports out there. I mean, with those 7 pillars, how are we going with that? Like, is it being implemented? How long do you think it'll take before it really gets embraced by the majority of sports?
Yeah, well, there's but Paperwatch can't we, and we don't have the capacity to have if we had the capacity, we would certainly do it. Have an overall broad measurement of how it's all going across all sports. In a beautiful world, with good resourcing, that would happen. Definitely, that would happen. But individual organisations track in the different ways. So someone like Belgravia Leisure, they based around 2 things: 7 pillars. They work around diversity. You probably know more on this than me, Dave. Yeah. And also universal design principles based around that too. Now, in my take on that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, that they were kind of using the 7 pillars as the common language and a common framework above all that. But in a specific area of disability especially, they're using universal design principles, which in effect are pretty much the same sort of thing, in effect, for doing some very specific work in that area. But the overall broad framework was based around the 7 pillars. Now, I know Belgravia Leisure do comprehensive evaluations and monitoring of that, and they have to do it in their own context. So, that's for them. And if people are interested, I'm sure Belgravia, I'll dob them in. I'm sure they'd be very happy to share some of those outcomes. Yeah, they have. Did I sum that all right, Dave?
Yeah, you did, and I think I'm going to chat with Dr. Jeff Oakley in a couple of weeks as well. So
he'll fill you in more. Ask him about because he'll be able to explain that better than me.
Yeah, no, you did well. But I think you're right. The implementation of the pillars, I think it's different for different groups, but there are some commonalities there. And for anybody, I would encourage them to have a look at the pillars of inclusion. So
yeah. One thing I will add to that, Dave, from a national level, again, I've made this mistake myself, but from a national level, I've seen it repeatedly over the years. This sort of thing, like the 7 pillars or like multiple other programs, tends to be too dogmatic in the way it's given out, produced. One thing I learned from the Sports Connect and 7 pillars days is develop a framework, make it fairly simple to pretty quick to understand, but step away to a certain extent from how that's implemented. And Belgrave is a beautiful example of that, because you say, here's a framework based on some good thinking and some good process behind it. Use it the way it suits you, because you can't develop a national program like that and be too rigid about it.
Yeah.
You can't. I mean, it doesn't work because contexts are different. The way that organisations operate are different and people are different. So you provide the framework and some of the tools around that and some of the monitoring, but in a sense you've got to let it go.
Yeah, and I think each community is different, and then I think the training and development of staff is really important, isn't it, in terms of all
Yeah.
that in-service training. So I'll just move on to the next question, and this is around COVID. How we had to mention it, and its impact on community sport. So obviously, COVID's had an impact on community sport like no other, and we're obviously in different stages across the country. But you recently wrote how community sport is fighting back, and I love it. And how can we make sure that inclusion and diversity continues to prosper when there's more unemployment? You know, people have got less disposable income. In some areas, leisure services are being reduced because obviously some councils are looking at the economic side of it, and you know, some sports clubs are just surviving. So, you know, if I sum it up, ultimately there's an increased inequality potentially. I think we're moving into, and I think that cliff, that edge, we're not even there yet. I think. Yeah. So how do we go with keeping inclusion and diversity at the forefront?
Yeah, it's been a topic, hasn't it? If I could show my other screen here, I have all the awards nominations and the details of them right here.
Yeah.
And you know that those awards focus on what sports and clubs have done in this period over the last few months to get through, and it's really heartening. And to be honest, it's really encouraging. It's quite a privilege to read them. Honestly, I'm blown away by the amount of work that clubs and associations have done. Innovative, hours and hours and hours they put in thousands of hours of voluntary work. So that's given us a really good snapshot. I also was part of a series of think tanks recently. We call them. They're on live interviews with people who work nationally and do a lot of work in the area. And that was certainly a topic about how we potentially will lose the momentum that we had around inclusion, diversity because of COVID. Like you said, we have people who are out of jobs. So inclusion officers and diversity officers I was working with months ago are no longer there. And there was quite a network. And even 5 or 10 years ago in my work, I could count the people working really on this on my two hands. You know, there wasn't that many who were working on this full time and within sport. But there were many. Up until last year, there were tons of them. Networks in the States developed in most states and territories, networks of people whose job it was, who are now out of a job, who are not driving inclusion. And that begs two questions in my mind. It says, well, okay, we weren't probably if we said this happened 5 years' time, we might be in a better position, because the role of that inclusion diversity officer has been more about being the gatekeeper of change rather than the agent of change. And I hate to use that language, but it kind of makes sense. That they were the go-to person for inclusion diversity because it was their name, it was their job title, it was where they often had a background in that area, certainly a very strong commitment and definitely making a difference. But there was a reliance on those people to do the work. So take those people away and that work goes. We faced this in the 90s and the 2000s working through the Sports Commission, because I'm through the unit that I managed, we employed inclusion officers in 7 sports and they were engaged. We co-funded with national bodies inclusion and diversity officers. I still work with a few of them right now who had those jobs at that time. And we worked really hard to make sure that they were facilitators of change and not the agents of change. So their job description was not about doing it themselves. It was about how do you train and facilitate inclusion within basketball. So Jackie, who was the basketball inclusion officer, basketball had a great attitude to it, one of the first sports to adopt a full-time inclusion diversity person. We designed the job description very specifically to be, this is the facilitator of change here. So she's going to run training for your marketing people. She's going to run training she's not going to do the marketing herself, even though she could. She's not. She's going to train the marketing people to market basketball as an inclusive sport. And as much as we tried, it often came, the default position of sports was often, no, actually, Jackie, we need this done next week. can you do it? And she could, but it didn't facilitate, it didn't really embed inclusion there, because what she should have done is say, okay, if just a very crude example, but it actually did happen, says, well, we want to make sure our brochures and our posters and our literature and our collateral, it reflects diversity, so particularly people with disabilities, because wheelchair basketball had come under the auspices of Basketball Australia at that time. So they wanted to depict it as this big inclusive sport. And they said to Jackie, well, what do we need to do? What kind of imagery do we need to depict that? And Jackie could have done it like that. I mean, she did actually do it. She knew exactly the sort of things they were talking about. But what she should have done is probably spent 4 or 5 months training and supporting the marketing people to do it themselves, so that it's embedded within their culture, so it's embedded in what they do, so they all understand that it's not good enough just to put someone in a wheelchair basketball and saying that's it. No, that's not actually good enough on brochure. There's lots of other issues around that. So, it was really difficult though to do it in a sports sense. And I think if I generalize that to the sports sector coming into COVID, we were getting there, but now that's going away again, and we're going to have to get it back. We're going to have to think, okay, now more than ever, we need to facilitate, all of us need to get involved in this. It's not an option, because if we rely on individuals again, they can come back. Some of them probably hopefully will, but some of them won't. And they could go again. We could face this again in a couple of years for different reasons. It goes in circles. So you can't keep relying on individuals is the message, that you've got to embed it somehow. I think we can do, what we can all do, we can keep shouting. We can keep on the bandwagon. And people like you and me and thousands of others can keep on that bandwagon. And I think there has been a bandwagon, and it's been pretty powerful recently, but it needs to keep going. It needs to not let it drop. And I'm quite heartened by the fact I don't think it will drop. It's just who's going to do the nitty gritty work, the detailed work of inclusion and diversity. It's great, there's plenty of voices out there, there's been plenty of discussion generated by all sorts of different angles, but we need to keep that going. That's the one thing everyone can do. Keep saying this is probably going to make sport survive better than ever, is that we have to reflect the communities that we're in, and we have to embrace diversity and inclusion in its really core self. And if we keep that as a message from people like you and me and the thousands of others there, I think that we'll do good. We'll do good.
I love that theme of you describing to reflect the community you're in, the demographic that you're in. I think that's so important. And I think the comeback's always better than the setback anyway, isn't it? So, I'm buoyant, and I want to be on that bandwagon, as you call it, as well. So this leads me to my last question, Peter. We've run over a little bit, but it's been so good speaking to you that I've been enjoying it so much I couldn't speed it along. But where do you see yourself personally in the system, and how do you contribute and influence to it? Now, you've kind of mentioned that bit with all your work that you do. But just thinking about you personally.
Yeah. Well, I did a few work a few years ago around. I'm trying to think of a different kind of answer to this, and then around what I call connectors, mavens, and salesmen. I wrote about it a fair bit at the time, and it's taken from some of the work of Malcolm Gladwell.
Yes.
He talks about connectors, so people who, and certainly part of my role is connecting people. That's what it is, and I kind of do it every day, sometimes in a small way, sometimes in a big way. After so many years of working as well, and Play by the Rules being what it is, my role as a connector in the industry is really good in that way. And it's also important to knowing that part of the connector is knowing the importance of consequential strangers in that as well. So I don't have to necessarily like or get on with everybody, but I need to connect them up and join the dots all the time. And sometimes first I think, I'm not sure about that, but I'm gonna, it's not for me to make that judgment really. It's me to connect people up. And my role nationally, I've worked nationally for 27, 28 years, that's been always a part of it, but now more so than ever to be a connector. The second part that I wrote about is being a maven. So after so many, maven is I think it's a Yiddish word, Jewish word for someone who has a great knowledge around a particular area. And I'm not saying that I have necessarily a great knowledge, but I have certainly got experience in the area, and I need to give that out. I'm not shy. I don't want to. People shouldn't be shy about giving that experience out and the opinions out and that kind of thing too. So getting it out there and publishing in that way is a constant. And being a salesman, so being an advocate as well, which comes with a bit of confidence, but you've got to sell it out there. So your conference presentations, the way that you write, the way that you publish, the way that you present, you'd be a salesman for that. And Gladwell talks about it in 3 different ways. He says that some people are just connectors, and I know people who are just connectors. I mean, they are amazing connectors, and they know far more than many people. I'm essentially an introverted, so I don't necessarily get out, but people who are extroverted connectors and have knowledge in this area are amazing in that, but that's what their strength is. Some people are mavens, so they know a hell of a lot, but they don't connect very well and they don't sell it. But they're really knowledgeable in their specific areas, and certainly we could all name people like that. And some people are really good salesmen. They don't actually do a great deal other than that, but it's a very valuable role, and not demoting it at all. It's an important role to have as a salesman. But I see myself kind of, and it's not saying about myself, but I think people who've been around for a while are all 3. You can be mixtures of them. So ever since I did that work a number of years ago now, I've often thought, okay, today what I'm doing now is connecting. I've been connecting this morning for all the awards winners and connecting them up and saying, I'm going to showcase your work on Play by the Rules. We're going to grab a case study of all the 131 nominations for the awards because there's great stuff there, and I'm going to publish it. Is that okay? So I'm being the salesman as well. I'm using my knowledge of what they've done to be able to, so I'm being a maven all at the same time.
Yeah.
So if people, that really helped me doing that work and reading about it. I recommend anyone read The Tipping Point from, well, you get the idea of it, how major changes happened through being connectors, mavens, and salesmen. So I think that's how I see my role now, as a kind of bit of all 3.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think I'll definitely be taking those and putting them in my toolkit. And I love the simplicity of it, in terms of being the connector, the maven, and the salesman. So what a wonderful way to come to the end of this chat, Peter. And I really thank you for sharing, your experiences early on and how, I suppose you fell into the industry. But I'm really inspired by you and all the work that you've done. And I know there's a lot of people out there as well. And, keep doing what you're doing. But I just want to thank you for your time and acknowledge you for all the work that you do for the sector and continue to do. But is there anything that you'd like to add?
Not especially. Just like I say, I think everybody can get on the bandwagon. Don't be shy. Get out there and promote it, because there is a danger. There is a danger that it will drop off the agenda, inclusive diversity. Drop off the agenda in these times, and but I've been really, like I say, I've been really heartened by what's happened through the awards and reading through them all. Some fantastic work going on. I mean, to celebrate that, I didn't talk about that much, but we need to celebrate the successes and what people have done in this area. And we're generally fairly good at that as a community, but you can never have enough, in my opinion. So.
Yeah, celebrating the wins is important, and good luck with writing back to every one of those, nominees. And all the best for the rest of the year.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Catch up with you soon, Peter. Cheers.